Section 2 of The Romance of an Old Fool. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Romance of an Old Fool by Roswell Field. Section 2. The thought that my train was to leave at 10 o'clock did not depress me as I awoke, with the sunlight streaming through the window. For, after all, I was obliged to admit that the monotony of Meadowvale and the sluggishness of my village friends were beginning to have an appreciable effect. Then the memory of little Sylvia came to me again, and nothing seemed pleasanter, as a benediction of the old days, than a visit to the burying ground where she was sleeping. The previous day I had paid the obligations of remembrance and respect to the graves of my kindred, and it gave me at first an uncomfortable feeling to realize that the thought of them was less potent than the recollection of this young girl. But was it strange or inexcusable? Had they not lived out their lives of honored usefulness and grown old and weary of the battle? And had not she passed away just as the greater joys of living were unfolding, and the assurance of happiness was the stronger? Poor Sylvia! The spectacle of a correctly dressed, middle-aged man passing down the street, bearing a somewhat cumbersome burden of lilies of the valley and forget-me-nots, must have had its peculiar significance to the inhabitants of the village, and many curious glances were my reward. I passed along, however, without explanations, in distinct violation of rural etiquette. The old caretaker of the burying ground met me at the entrance and gave me the directions. Second path to the right, halfway up the hill, just to the left of the big elm. The old man had known me as a boy and would have detained me in conversation, but I pleaded that my time was short, and reluctantly he let me go my way. Slowly up the hill I walked, occasionally pausing to place a forget-me-not on the grave of one I had known in childhood. Even old Barrows did not escape my passing tribute, a cynical, cross-grained old fellow, the aversion of the boys who tormented him, and whom he tormented with reciprocal vigor. No need of a forget-me-not for Barrows, for he never forgot anything. So I gave his somewhat neglected grave the token of a long stem of little lilies, in evidence that the past was forgiven, and moved on to avoid possible protestation. I paused under the wide-branching elm to recover my breath. The ascent had been arduous for a gentleman inclined to portliness and with wind impaired by tobacco. I turned to the left, and at that moment, just before me, a woman's figure slowly rose from the ground. A creeping sensation possessed me. My heart bounded and my pulses thrilled. Was this Sylvia risen from the dead? Surely it was Sylvia's graceful girlish form. This was Sylvia's oval face, with Sylvia's large gray eyes. In such a way, Sylvia's pretty light hair waved about her temples, and the pink and white of her delicate complexion revealed the blue veins. 25 years had rolled back in an instant, and I was standing in the presence of the past. Alas, the swift passing of the illusion, for the conversation of the evening came to me. "You are Phyllis?" I said. "I am Phyllis," she answered softly, her mother's voice. "And you are Mr. Stanhope. My aunt told me." I did not answer, for I was staring stupidly at her, reluctant to abandon the pleasing fancy that my thinking of her had brought her back from the dead again. She did not speak, but glanced inquiringly at the flowers I held in my hand. "I knew your mother, Phyllis. I managed to say. She was a very dear playmate of my childhood. I have brought these flowers to put upon her grave. Shall we go together? The girl's eyes filled, and she pointed to the rising mound at her feet. Suddenly we bent over and reverently laid the lilies and forget-me-nots under the simple headstone. "May I talk to you of your mother?" I asked. We sat down on a rude bench in the path, and I told her of my childhood, of the days when Sylvia and I were sweethearts, of our little quarrels and frolics, of her mother's beauty and gentleness. The girl laughed at the recital of our misadventures, and the tears came into her eyes when I touched on my boyish affection for my playmate. Then she told me of her own life, so peaceful and happy in the little village, and in the neighboring town, where she had been educated with all the care and diligence of the New England impulse. I looked at my watch. "It is 11:15, I said ruefully, "and my train left at 10. "There's another train at 3, she replied. "You will go home and dine with us? We dine at 12 in the country, you know." If I was somewhat ashamed to face Mary Eastman, she received us with the same stolidity she had manifested when we first met, and at once insisted that I should remain for dinner. "Go into the parlor," she said abruptly. Phyllis plucked the sleeve of my coat. "Don't go in there," she whispered. "That's Aunt Mary's room exclusively, and I'm afraid you'll not find it very cheerful. Come out on the porch." "I know the room," I whispered back as we went out together. "At least I know the type. Lots of horsehair belongings, square piano against the wall, wax flowers under a glass case on the mantel, steel engravings of Washington crossing the Delaware, family album, huge Bible, and famous women of 2 centuries on the center table, seashells, blue Wedgwood and German china things mingled in delightful confusion on the whatnot. If not wax flowers, it's wax fruit." Phyllis laughed, how much her laugh was like her mother's, and nodded her head. "Not a bad description," she assented. "You must have the gift of second sight." "Not second sight. Suppose we call it the gift of second childhood." We sat on the porch and looked down on the lawn that sloped to the orchard, and watched the robins run across the grass. And I pointed out to Phyllis the very tree under which Sylvia and I had stood the day we had our first memorable quarrel, confessing that while at the time there was no doubt in my mind that Sylvia was clearly at fault, I was now prepared to concede, after plenty of reflection, that possibly she might have had a reasonable defense. The recital of this pathetic incident led to other reminiscences connected with the old house and its grounds, and I was hardly in the second chapter when Mary came out and ordered us in to dinner. Mary never invited, never requested. She merely ordered. We sat at the table, and at a severe look from Mary, I stopped fumbling with my napkin, while Phyllis, sweet saint, folded her hands and asked the divine blessing. Pagan philosopher that I was singularly moved by the simple faith of these 2 women, and I think that when I am led back into the fold of my family creed, a girl as young and fair and holy as Phyllis will be the angel to guide me. The dinner was toothsome, the environment fascinating, the afternoon perfect, and so it came about quite naturally that I missed the 3:00 train. "There is nothing so disagreeable in life," I explained apologetically to my friends, as a hard and fast schedule which keeps one jumping like an electric clock, doing 60 things every hour and never varying the performance. Fortunately, trains run every day except Sunday, and the general order of the universe is not going to be upset because I am not checking myself off like a section hand. Perhaps Mary did not wholly coincide with my argument, but she was called away to her sewing circle, while Phyllis and I lounged lazily on the porch, I continuing my reminiscences. Garrulity is not merely the prerogative of age. The privilege of the monologue is always that of the old boy who comes back to his childhood's home and finds in a pretty girl a charming and attentive listener. He is a poor orator, indeed, who cannot improve such opportunities. At a convenient lull in the flow of discourse, we went off to ride, exploring the country roads I knew so well, and here began new matter and new reminiscences, patiently endured by Phyllis, who was a most delightful girl. And when we returned late in the afternoon, it was directly in the line of circumstances that I should remain for tea. And after tea, Phyllis played and sang for me in the little parlor, for Phyllis was a musician of no small merit. When in reply to my inquiry she sang a simple Scotch ballad her mother had sung so touchingly many years before, a great lump rose in my throat, and I sat far over in the shadow, that she and Mary might not see how blurred were my eyes, and how unmanageable my emotion. At what age does it come to a man and a philosopher that he is no longer ashamed of honest, sympathetic tears? I shall never know whether it was the journey in the train, the air and cooking of Meadowvale, or the visits to the burying ground that upset me. But for the first time in a dozen years, I found myself dissatisfied with my home. I remarked to Malachi that the roses seemed to be in a most discouraging condition, and that the garden in general was altogether disappointing. I noticed that my dogs barked a great deal, that the neighbors had become most tiresome, and that Bunsey was an unmitigated nuisance. Even the cuisine, which had been my pride and boast, grew at times unbearable, and I had not been home a fortnight before I astonished Prudence by positively assuring her that the dinner she had set before me was not worth any sane man's serious attention. Whereupon that excellent woman announced with superb pride that she guessed it was about time for that Rogers woman to give another card party. "Prudence," I said severely, for I encourage no flippancy on the part of domestics, "that remark, while probably hasty and ill-considered, borders on impertinence. I shall overlook it this time, on account of your faithful service in the past. But don't let it happen again. In any event," I amended considerately, "don't let it drop in my presence." Thinking it over, I came to the conclusion that Prudence was right in the general effect of the suggestion. What I needed was a change of scene. Long abstention from travel and variety of incident had made me restless and discontented. I had not been in Europe for 2 years. Undoubtedly, I was pining for a lazy tour of the continent. The thought decided me. I should book my passage on the steamer that sailed the Saturday of the following week. Strangely enough, at this interesting moment, I received a letter from the chairman of the Committee on Public Improvements in the village of Meadowvale, announcing that it had been resolved to procure new rooms for the village library, and would Mr. John Stanhope, do his native village the honor of subscribing a small amount toward this desirable end. As it is always much easier for an indolent man to telegraph than to write letters, I replied by wire that Mr. Stanhope felt himself much honored by the request. Not entirely satisfied with this confession, I sent a second telegram an hour later, doubling my subscription. Still, my conscience troubled me. I have not done my duty, I said to myself. Here I am, a man of means, I may say of large wealth, with no special obligations resting upon me, and yet I have done nothing to benefit or enrich my old home. It is strange that it has not occurred to me before what a privilege, what an honor it is to be a philanthropist, even in a small way, and with what alacrity those whom heaven has blessed with a fortune should respond to the calls of deserving need. I blush for my past thoughtlessness, and I shall hasten to atone for my astonishing neglect. My duty lies before me, and I shall not shrink from it, whatever the personal inconvenience. Thereupon I telegraphed for the third time to the chairman that it would give Mr. Stanhope the greatest pleasure to put up a suitable library for the village of Meadowvale, and, in order to guard against any possible misunderstanding, he would depart the following day to confer with the committee as to site and probable extent of the structure. This concession to my conscience comforted me greatly, and I prepared for my journey with a lightness that was almost buoyancy. The chairman and two of the committee met me at the junction. They were most deprecatory and apologetic, and mentioned with evident sorrow the absence of several of the members, which might cause a postponement of the conference until the following day. I bore up under this intelligence with astonishing cheerfulness. End of section 2. Recording by Roger Moline.